Hi, I'm Angela Wolf, fashion designer and online instructor, and today I want to show you how to make a very simple one-shoulder top and add a ruffle. You can use a pattern for this or alter your own. So let me show you how to get started. The first thing you want to do, now here on this paper is an actual pattern for a one-arm tee or a tank. And all you have to do if you have a t-shirt is just cut off one of the shoulders. Pretty simple to do, right? Now, if your pattern doesn't have a ruffle, you can add your own. So all you do is you go across and measure this area and take away both seam allowances. So for me, I would measure around here, it's 15 inches. I would take away 1 whole inch because that's half of an inch and half of an inch. So I would take 14 and I would add 14 to whatever this side measures as. I'm just doing this quickly, but again, take away a whole inch for each seam allowance, and I'm down to 14.5. So I would take that entire measurement, and all this is, yes, you're seeing it correctly, it's a circle. Now, your ruffle can be as long as you want it, as short, and as ruffly. So this is the difference. This is the same width all the way around. For this specific pattern, it's 5 inches. If you wanted a longer ruffle, you would just make this a little bit longer. This width here will match up to this area when I attach it. If you want more ruffles, you'd want this to be a little tighter. So I'm just going to give you a little quick look here. If you do a circle and you start making the circle bigger, I know that sounds so weird, but that's how you make the ruffles. Let me just show you a couple examples. I think that'll make it easier. So check out this ruffle here. It's part of an oval, and when I hold it out, there's not much going on there. Let's compare that to this here. See how it's a wider oval? So that's what I'm trying to explain. Here you go. How about this one? This is this pattern. And now what happens when I hold it up? A really nice ruffle. That's the difference. So you can make your own ruffle any size. It just has to go around the neckline. So let me show you a few tips for sewing this in place. I'm going to use a sewing machine and a serger, and I'll show you why. So here's my one-arm top. I have already sewn the shoulder and the side seams. I've cut a binding, which is the width of the fabric, and this is just 2 inches wide. And usually I would just attach that to the neckline. But first you're going to install the ruffle. So I have this set at a basting stitch, which is a stitch length of 5.0 in case you don't know that. And I'm just going to stitch a little area here. Now usually I just use the serger or sometimes a zigzag stitch on knits, but for the ruffle I want to insert it first before I add the binding. It just makes it a little bit easier. And I want to point out a certain technique here. As I'm stitching, when you're attaching binding, usually you stretch the binding to keep the neckline close. For the ruffle, I'm not doing that. I'm just stitching these both in place at the exact same lengths of fabric. So they're both just stitching. I'm going to go down a little bit further. So I'm just going to do one section again. Use a contrasting thread so you can see it. So what I have here, I'll just hold this up. I've attached the binding to one side of the top. You can see the ruffle is hanging nicely. Nothing is stretched out. That's very important. That's where knits get a little tricky. So the next thing I'm going to do is baste the binding in place. Now you have a choice. You could baste the binding in place first or just run it through the serger. To be honest, if I was home sewing in my studio, I would just attach it to the serger, but I think you'll see it a little bit better if I do this. Again, I would sew my binding into a full circle, but since I'm only doing one little section here, I'm just going to leave this raw. Now, this section gets a little bit different. Whatever your seam allowance is, mine's half of an inch. Now, there's the fabric and the ruffle. Here's my binding. I'm going to stitch a little bit, and all the way across the front of the top, I'm going to stretch the binding just a little bit, and this will prevent your top from gapping open. Again, I'm just using a basting stitch because I'm going to pull both of these stitches out or serge them off in a minute. So here's one more look before I go to the serger. Here's my binding. I stretch it just a little bit. If you're unsure how much you should stretch it, usually my binding is 1 inch, maybe 2 inches less in circumference than the neckline. So if that helps you out, and you could pin it in place first. Just be careful with knits when you're pinning. So now this fabric is going to wrinkle just a little bit because of the basting stitch. Once I pull that out, it'll be fine. So you can see this is holding it in place, and there's the ruffle. So let's go to the serger. Now here I have a choice. I could just serge that entire area off, but I want to show you this is what it's going to end up looking like. So get that fabric out of the way. So here I'm using a 4-thread overlock stitch. I'm using contrasting threads so you can see what's going on. And now I have attached my binding to the top of the neckline. Very simple to do. This will stretch to go over your head. And let's go back up here, and I want to show you a couple finishes for the ruffle. So here I have this fabric. If you notice, a lot of knits don't fray. So on these knits, as I'm going through here, this fabric did not fray. This is a crepe knit, so I just left it raw. On the hems, this is a double cover hem, which would look really cute along this. If your fabric does fray, which you can see here, this one does not fray either. And this one does. So this was just a cotton knit. So if you look closely, now I didn't use a contrasting thread on this because I'm going to wear it, but on this, I actually pressed this under and did 2 rows of cover stitch. Some for decoration, some for finishing, so that's another option. Now there are so many ways that you could attach this ruffle. This is what it looks like when you use the binding. You could also just attach the ruffle like this, but I just think this gives it a little bit better finish. So that is how simple it is to take a pattern, turn it into one shoulder, and add a ruffle.